We'll talk about code quality and the relevance of code coverage to it. Code coverage is a very controversial topic. I've actually come across clients who really shudder the minute I mention the word code coverage. But I think that comes from quite a bit of misunderstanding of how valuable code coverage can really be. But like any metric or tool we use, we got to be careful using code coverage as well. So in this presentation, we'll talk about code coverage. What is it? What's a good number to achieve? Is it really useful? And if so, how is it? And why should we care about it? So let's first get started with what's code coverage. We write code and we hope that the code actually does what it's supposed to do. Well, we need to have a little bit more than a hope. We want to ensure the code actually is doing what it's supposed to do. And we have come across a situation where we have written the code, it works fine until one day it doesn't. Why is it? Because we made some change and we made the change with certain assumptions and context in our mind, but we haven't thought through other consequences. And suddenly the code ends up breaking, and that breakage usually comes a little later than we need to have that kind of a feedback. So a quick feedback is very useful, a feedback from test that the code that worked once is no longer working because we made some change to it. In order to do this, we want to make sure we have fairly good amount of test on the code. Now, what kind of test are we talking about? Well, I would really like to have as much automated test as possible. I would like to call these as automated verifications, but that doesn't mean we don't want any manual testing. There are times when manual testing has enormous benefit, and I'm not going to completely ignore it. But if everything we do is automated, or if everything we do is manual, both of those are very risky. There's got to be a fairly good combination of automated testing and manual testing, where manual testing is for some gnarly area. Maybe we are interested in looking for some usage, usability, performance in a certain niche area where we are trying to get with a certain new set of data, whatever it is, right? So there's a bit of a manual testing we have to do, but there is a significant amount of automated testing also. But to me, I would like to have 100% code coverage. Let me emphasize that, 100% code coverage, but not from unit test. I think that's crazy to ask for 100% coverage from any one particular type of test. But if there is code that has never been exercised, nobody ever cared to exercise through manual testing or automation testing, I would argue, why is that code really there? So bring together your automated unit testing, automated function testing, automated integration testing, any form of testing, plus your manual testing together, and collect the code coverage on all these tests put together, and look at the amount of code coverage you have. And I want that number to be very, very high, as close to 100% if at all possible. So having a good coverage is something I care about a lot. In my own code, I've got a very high coverage. About 100% is what I would really like to have. And if not, I would go back and look at why I haven't been able to achieve that. And if I really do test-driven development, I should have close to 100% coverage anyways. So put together manual testing, automated testing, everything together, I want a very, very high coverage. Now, while I emphasize this, I always wonder, am I just being adamant? Am I just being pedantic about this? And I have to say a couple of different things. One thing is, when I have looked at code coverage numbers that are fairly low, I go in to see why there is low coverage, but I often end up spending time on looking at either a particular problem that springs from the code or a poor quality of code that is in front of me. In other words, code coverage, low code coverage draws me to code, and the end result is refactoring to either remove a problem or to make the code quality better. So I look at code coverage not as something to beat down the development team on, but as an indicator as, hey, here's a problem of investigation, here's a problem area, something that draws an alarm or attention to it. That is the way I look at it. Let's quickly talk about code coverage. When I look at code coverage, I want to see how much percentage of coverage I have in code. So to give you an example, here is a code coverage number I pulled out from one of my projects. And it tells us the percentage cover. Of course, I'm showing you a glorified picture here of 100% on these. It shows the number of lines of code that it is looking at. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of lines of code. Well, that's because there was not a whole lot of lines of code needed for this particular fully functional production code that's in place. It shows the relevant number of lines of code, the lines covered by this test, and lines missing. And it tells us there are not any lines missing. Of course, you may say, wait a minute, there's 92 lines over here, but it shows only 50 lines covered. Why is that? Well, there are things like function declaration and definitions, class definition. Those lines, for example, are blank lines of code and stuff like that. Whereas this is the real lines of code that's out there. That's a relevant lines of code, as you can see. And the relevant lines of code are covered. And it tells us the average hits per line, how many tests that I have that actually hit this particular line of code. And it shows some of those. For some very low, of course, very few lines of relevant number of lines of code, for a few that are higher actually. But if you drill into one of the files, and I'm not showing you the files over here, if you drill into one of the files, it shows that there are 50 lines of code covered in this particular file, and over here it shows for every single line which are covered, it shows in green. And if there was any file that was not covered or a line of code that was not covered, it would show in red. So we can quickly take a look at that based on the code we are writing. So when I normally look at code, I look at the coverage area and I see wherever there is a low coverage, I drill into the code, and like I said, it usually draws me into either a poor quality code that needs fixing or refactoring, or I kind of examine the code and say, why is this code doing this? And it usually points me to some problems. So I don't go into code coverage with the vengeance that, oh, coverage is really poor here, I'm going to beat down on why the coverage is low, but more of, hey, this code is kind of calling for help, let me take a look at it. So what's a good coverage number? Like I mentioned, I don't want 100% coverage in one area of test because that's naive and impractical, but combine all your tests, automated and manual. I want to have a coverage as close to 100% as possible. And if you think there's a certain area where you cannot have a certain coverage, I would like to know and learn about it rather than being adamant about it's got to have the coverage. I would like to learn about it, discuss about it, and then figure out whether that should be left alone, or maybe we can think of a way to test it by maybe refactoring if necessary. Of course, in legacy code, that's a very different story, but I'm talking about code which is test driven and how we could achieve it. But is this really useful? And there are two benefits I've seen about having a good code coverage. Now, the first benefit is it draws me into code, shows me some problem areas, and even invariably, I've been studying this for the past about 5 years now, and every time I look at a code coverage that is poor, I immediately ask myself, what am I here for? Why do I want to look into it? Am I really being adamant about code coverage? And I would even be willing to, at those times, look at the coverage and say, yeah, this shouldn't be really worried about. Let's move on. And I would jump into the code. And rather than telling developers to write tests in those cases, I invariably find problems, smelly things in the code, and suggest refactoring, and that eventually improves the coverage in the process as well. So I find code coverage to be invaluable tool, and I really care about this a lot. And again, with the emphasis that I'm not really emphasizing a high coverage value, but a low coverage usually seems to be an indicator. In other words, I look at code coverage like cholesterol number. If you go to the doctor and you get the blood work done and the cholesterol LDL is very high and poor value and HDL is low, what does the doctor say? The doctor says your cholesterol number is really bad. You are in poor health. If you continue with this, that could be trouble. You need to start eating right, start exercising, and maybe take a certain cholesterol medicines, and let's check back in 6 months and see how your cholesterol number is doing. And maybe you work really hard, you eat well, you exercise, and you take those medicines, and you go back for a repeat exam, and the doctor says, hey, look, your cholesterol number has improved, your LDL is down, your HDL is up, whatever you're doing, keep it up, good job, let's check back in 6 months. And you say, hey, can you sign here that I'm in really good health? And the doctor says, no, I can't sign a bill of good health for you like that. Your cholesterol number is okay. That means you don't have that imminent problem, but that doesn't mean you are in perfect health otherwise. So much like that, a code coverage, low value of coverage indicates a problem, but a high value of coverage doesn't mean the code is good or even the test have covered all the situations. For example, you could have 100% code coverage and you may be missing out very important tests because they have not tested a certain conditions or certain edge cases in the code. So a high coverage number doesn't mean everything is good, but a low coverage number often is an indicator of some problem. And like I mentioned, anytime I've been drawn into it with a low coverage, I've always discovered some issue to fix, rather than saying go write more test cases. So why should we care about code coverage? I have seen in my past 5 years of experience with focusing on code coverage itself and critically analyzing whether there is usefulness to this, I found that code coverage, really a poor value of it rather, leads me often to a poor quality code. So as a result, I often want to look at code coverage as one of the metrics I see on code, not with the intention of beating down on the programmers, but more with the intention of, hey, let's examine this code and see why it's got poor coverage, understand it, and invariably that's pointed out to a quality of code that could be improved. So on my projects, I do emphasize fairly good amount of code coverage. I use it fairly well, and I've really seen the benefits of it. And in teams that I work with, this is something that I actually emphasize quite a bit, and again with the right intention of improving the quality rather than on beating down on the programmers that they should really be writing more test cases. And I hope that you would find use in this particular metric as well.